Week talking about a tunnel under the 401. He says he believes Mark Carney will put it on that now infamous major projects list. The second tranche of that is expected before the Grey Cup in the middle of November. But he also wrote an open letter today calling for the Carney government to keep tariffs on electric vehicles, writing in part at a time on Chinese electric vehicles, I should say, at a time when our automotive sector is under enormous financial pressures because of President Trump's tariffs. Canada's tariff on Chinese-made EVs is critical to protecting more than 157,000 direct jobs in Ontario and hundreds of thousands of indirect jobs across the country. Let's bring back the front bench to talk about a schism emerging for the first time on these two issues between the federal government and the Premier. We've got Sharon Carr, Laura D'Angelo, Jamie Ellerton, and Sebastian Skamsky here. Let's start off sort of on the tunnel and the list, because I think that's been one of the more interesting sub-stories out of this major project stuff, Jamie. What we had seen at the beginning of that announcement last week was, of all people, Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, reacting very positively. And counterintuitively, the Premier of Ontario basically saying, like, is this it? And now pushing very hard on the tunnel, even though it had appeared for weeks that they had a very chummy relationship. What do you make of that?
When you actually listen to the clip, it sounds like it's a story that's really just generated by the fact that he got pushed and kind of course, he's going to defend his project in the moment and substantiate it with the follow-up question. I would point out that the government themselves have admitted that they're doing a feasibility study at this point. They've done some market sounding, and we don't know what this tunnel is going to be aside from what the Premier has envisioned this when he's talked about it at media avails. And I think when you compare a project like this with the others that have been announced and are being talked about for this major project list, this is so early in the game for the potential for this to ever be, let alone actually open, but just to start to be built. It's kind of curious, the politics of this. So I think that's one thing that stood out for me. And I think when you look at the broader relationship, Doug Ford has shown he's had zero issues putting his foot down when he wants to on something that's going to benefit his own political coalition and his own politics, while continuing to maintain a chummy relationship with Liberal governments federally. And I don't think that's going to deviate from that kind of like parallel track here.
Yeah, the only thing I would say on that, and I think that's true for the most part, Sharon, is I'm not sure, like, for example, on hitting back hard with counter tariffs, Doug Ford really stuck to his ground there. Like, he was saying how hard we had to go, and then when Prime Minister Carney signaled not so much, he seemed to say, well, I still wish we could go hard and we wouldn't back down, but, like, he's not shutting off the electricity or anything like that. How important do you think that relationship is with the Prime Minister? And ultimately, if it didn't get him better standing in this initial list, how important will the second list be?
So I think there's a few pieces here. I think that, putting the tunnel aside, I think anyone who's spoken to insiders who work closely with Premier Ford and question the viability of said tunnel always say that it's about nation building for him, in the sense that it's a long-term 100-year project. Like, none of us are going to see this tunnel built in our lifetime, and he said that as well. Now, that being said, Premier Ford is a very emotional person when he responds to things, and I don't say that in a bad way. I think it's more of he's very organic in his feelings and how he says things. So I think what we're seeing and how he responded to that was kind of him like being like, I'm not really happy about the fact that my project wasn't on the list. But part of the major projects list is about projects that can get done in the foreseeable future, not necessarily projects that can get done in 100 years from now. I know he's got these tunnel diggers that they used to use back in the day and that he really wants to use them here, but I don't think that this is going to be a long-term, I would say, problem between Carney and Ford. They do have a really good relationship. They do have this camaraderie around kind of being Captain Canada together. So I think this is a little bit of a temporary, he's upset and is just kind of digging his feet in the ground. And I think they'll get past it. There'll be something else that comes up. And I think maybe the tunnel will make it into list 2. Who knows? But it's not necessarily.
But why would it? We don't even know what it would cost. Like, we don't, like, that would go against everything the government has positioned this list as.
I would hope that it doesn't necessarily make it. But what I'm thinking and seeing is that the Prime Minister is willing to allow there to be some politics and concessions to it, and if it means,
you can admit it, yeah.
putting up pipeline, or like, I would rather see pipelines. I would rather see something about the Ring of Fire. And I think if the Prime Minister gives into some of these other projects that can bring real economic development to Ontario, I think Premier Ford will back down a little bit and be a little upset about it. But it's a tunnel that we're never going to see, guys.
Well, you never know. Sebastian, what do you think?
Well, if I know one thing about any government project being built, it is always reassuring when a new bureaucracy is involved. So I'm glad that Prime Minister Carney took that incredible step. to help, whether it's to build this tunnel in a century or to do anything around the Ring of Fire, for example. I believe Sharon mentioned that. Look, I think the tunnel itself is not, I know there's a lot of criticism on the part of the Liberals and the NDP about this being some kind of absurd idea. Of course, people who drive cars, normal people, common sense people who are part of the voting coalition, they drive cars, and it's, if you've ever been on the 401, it is maddening and frustrating. You know, and by the way, this has absolutely a lot of economic downsides and impacts, as Premier Ford mentioned. That said, listen, there are critical projects that need to happen right now that are not taking place, that I think would have a much more significant nation-building aspect. Prime Minister Carney has to really stop with these new bureaucracies and these wish lists and having the Premier sit on his lap and whisper in his ear what they want for Christmas. He just needs to get out of the way, frankly, so that things can be built, like the LNG export terminals, like pipelines. And I think that's got to be the priority for everyone at the table.
So just picking up on Ford's comments, the Premier's comments, Laura, it's not just on this issue, though. He's also flagging there's a cleavage on EV tariffs, right? Premier Moe was here from Saskatchewan. He's very encouraged by the openness the feds are showing to backing down on those initial tariffs or some sort of amelioration to them. Do you think that this is as temporary as Sharon characterizes the friction between Ford and Carney, or do you think it could turn into something more?
I think it could turn into something more, but what I actually think we're seeing is one of Ford's favorite tactics. Ford is very adept at advocating for his province, and he normally does that in the media in public ways. It's actually something that I think is often really fun to watch. And I do think that's what we're seeing here, is he is pulling out some of his favorite tools from his toolkit to push the feds on it. What I think is going to be really fun to watch is how the feds respond. They haven't really yet faced this with any of the premiers, right? It's actually been a really amicable, quite wonderful relationship so far between Carney and almost every premier across the country. And so I think that what's going to be interesting to watch is how Carney and his team thread the needle here with a premier who so far has been very supportive, who has actually really helped them move things along. And he's starting to express just a little bit of discontent. I think it'll be interesting to see how they respond. You might
even think in a few months, Jamie, the feds will feel some regret over the way in which they characterize, like, give me your lists to each of the premiers, right? That ultimately that kind of approach sets them up for a winners and losers type of situation where they are deciding, and on the other side of it is one premier who'll be happy and another who isn't.
Yeah, I think for the prime minister, you can kind of always look to triangulate and figure out what your message needs to be and how you deliver that in different parts of the country while still having some coherent economic vision. Of course, part of the problem when you talk about tariffs is it's always easier for someone with an entrenched interest to mobilize and say why something's bad than it is for some future upside that voters may or may not feel and feel attached to it somewhere down the road. And so I think when you look at the auto sector, it's just one example. The manufacturing sector in Ontario continues to be huge. And our auto sector is really the American auto sector with branch plants here. And so long as any possibility of a continental trade agreement that keeps those plants open here, I think it is highly unlikely you will ever see the federal government open the door to Chinese EVs. Now, if we actually blow up the relationship with the Americans and free trade as we know it is effectively dead, then I think there's a whole bigger debate in this country as to what free trade looks like with the rest of the world and choices that we're willing to make and what the consequences of that are. But like at this juncture, we are continuing to build those cars. Those are American companies operating here in Canada. And so long as that continues to be a true statement, I don't think those EV tariffs are going anywhere, especially when you look at the geopolitical game and triangulating us with the Chinese.
Okay, I got to leave it on that note.